Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I'm speaking today with Daniel Phelps, survivor of the World Revival Church, should we say cult or church? That's what we're going to be talking about. There's some really interesting stuff coming out recently on the church, an article on Fox News and some other investigations about potential abuse and other things. So let's get into it. Thanks for dropping into Mind Shift Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I know it was one of the hard things for me with this. Like, this was a church that I grew up with. So going into the backstory, my family had shown up in Missouri by way of the military because my dad was in the Air Force. And so I guess my mom got connected with the church through a work friend of hers. The church at the time was called Smithton Community Church. And so we started going in around 1989. And at the time, like, it just kind of seemed like this, regular country church in the middle of nowhere, town of like 532 people. We had the typical, Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and Wednesday services, which a lot of churches do, especially like in the evangelical charismatic realm. Like, there's nothing.
Yeah, it's not unusual. That. Yeah, I grew up in evangelical church in Seattle area. So yeah, we had typical Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday night prayer service, and all the rest of it. Yeah, so that's so far nothing, no red flags or anything.
Yeah, and especially at the time I was 5 years old, so
right, you were too young to know any different.
This is life. Yeah, and my parents' background, like, they were both ORU grads, which, heads up, I am too. So I went there later on in life.
Right, you went to Oral Roberts University.
I did.
Very nice. You definitely come out of the charismatic tradition, then, no question about it.
No question about it. So like, there's already a background, and then you go to this church and like, it just fits that box. Like, you don't see anything weird about it. It's like, yeah, like, we raise our hands, we speak in tongues, like all the usual, like, charismatic evangelical stuff. So then a few years after attending, they started adding a prayer service, which, again, like, that's not uncommon at all. Just, adding prayer. So now we added a fourth service to things. And then kind of around like the mid-90s, then you started hearing about these other like charismatic revivals going on. So there's the Toronto Blessing, there's the one going on in Pensacola, Florida. And around the time all this stuff was going on, there was like kind of a church split that I still don't really know what happened. I know there was some sort of issue that I think had to do with one of the pastor's adopted daughters and one of the youth leaders and the pastors themselves. I still don't know what happened. I haven't been able to get anyone to talk to me about it. And then the pastor left to go to Florida to the Pensacola revival for, at this point, like, I can't remember, like, but he was there for a while and we weren't sure when he was coming back.
So just a question, who was the head pastor when it was Smithton Community Church? Who was the head pastor at the time?
It's still the same pastor.
Same person. So this was one of the people on staff who left to go to Florida?
Not just, that's the whole thing in there. So Steve Gray is the pastor and Kathy Gray is his wife. They were the pastors then, they're the pastors now. This is all just kind of the backstory and kind of the initial kickoff to, like, I think when things like really just started becoming a huge mess. I think there's groundwork before, but like, I was so young and I can't find anyone to talk to me about that time period, really.
So something went down that the church kind of split anyway. I mean, it's, again, though, you have to say it's not unusual. It happens it's not unusual. Time. I went through a church split when I was a pastor. It happens. Well, I should say when I was an elder of a church, our church split when I was just in leadership, and half the church left to go plant another church. It wasn't over any sexual impropriety, just a different vision and all. So it happens a lot, doesn't it? That kind of thing.
It does. And so, but looking back on things, like here's the part that's a little more unusual. So these prominent people left. Nobody left with them. And that same night that they left, there is almost this weird thing that happened looking at it now, where everyone in the church then kind of like went up and said, where else would I go? I'm not leaving. Now I realize it was almost like taking a pledge to the pastor that we're with you. Like every single person in the building did that.
Okay. That's unusual.
That's unusual.
Yeah, that certainly didn't happen in our church. I mean, you could freely choose to stay or leave, and a bunch of people left and a bunch of people stayed. And that was, we just processed it as best we could. There wasn't any weird cult of personality or anything, going on.
No. And as a kid, I was like 11 or so at the time. Like I didn't, I'm just there. I don't know anything else.
Yeah. That's your reality.
Right.
It's normalized. Yeah.
So pretty close to the time that the pastor is going to come back, we had heard about the service that happened in Florida where it's like, hey, like this exciting thing happened. Everyone ran up to the front during the song, kicked off their shoes, jumped up and down. Cool. And then the worship pastor, who, side note, is also the head pastor's nephew. The whole church staff is staffed by Steve Gray's family members.
Right. So classic nepotism, in other words.
100%.
Yeah.
It just gets worse from here as time goes.
Again, though, you have to say that's normal, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, it's so many churches you can see. Head pastor is this person. You look at the staff members, family members, in-laws, relatives. Yeah, nepotism is rife in church leadership.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, a lot of issues with that. I think a lot of the issues don't come in when the church building is owned by the pastor's own personal company.
That is unusual.
When the staff is just the pastor's immediate family, like you look at the documents of the ministry, company, business, whatever, like it's pastor's wife, and then usually like maybe a daughter, nephew, someone like that who has like that immediate thing. So when he left, there's this idea given that, oh, he might not come back. Now I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, you own this church.
Yeah,
like literally, you own this church. Like, you can close up the doors if you want, but like you can't just leave this because you own this. So
that's really interesting, though, as a dynamic, isn't it? Because in so many cases,
now, side note, nobody knew that. I know that now,
right.
But nobody knew that.
Okay, there wasn't common knowledge. Yeah, because you don't want the head pastor owning the physical property where the church meets. That's right there. There's some red flags, isn't it? Because there's potential for abuse, not necessarily, but usually it's owned by the congregation in a sense. They own the building.
Yeah, but yeah, that's not the case with this. Nobody knew it because everything's tight and under wraps. But like now, I was like, yeah, you were coming back.
No doubt about it.
Okay, so we actually practiced that whole thing, like with like, hey, pastor walks in, we're going to play this song, everyone's going to run up to the front and kick off their shoes. And so, when that happens, that's exactly what happens. But then after that moment, when Steve Ray came back in, he's like, I don't know what happened here, but I'm going to come back tomorrow. And it's like, and take out that practice session, that moment is the origin story of the Smithan outpouring that happened on March 24th, 1996. That is this spontaneous movement where God flooded through the building. And then since then, it was, now I believe what was happening was he went to Florida to study what they were doing as a marketing thing to get attention.
Sure.
And it worked. It worked.
Absolutely. A lot of people did that though, didn't they? Because I can recall I was an evangelical when you mentioned the Toronto blessing. Yeah. I remember that. We used to study that. We studied that in seminary as a kind of a case study. And we saw people flew in from all over the world. I had a friend that went down to the Solomon Islands because there was some sort of revival going on there. I don't know if you remember that, but they would go down there, study it, and try to replicate what they were doing back in their home church. So even that isn't all that uncommon in Christianity.
No. Yeah, and learning what other people are doing is fine. I think the practicing of the origin story and making it sound like we didn't practice that,
right.
And then like,
revival just broke out immediately and instantaneously. It's a miracle.
Yeah, and all of a sudden, like, word spread. Like, Shoot Integrity Music did an album on the Smithton Outpouring. Visit from Newsweek, Time, Charisma, Christianity Today. Like, I mean, word spread, and like people were coming from all over the world. And eventually, you have an extra 500 people show up in a town of 500 people.
People are going to notice.
Okay, yeah, it's like, it's definitely outgrowing. So money was being raised to get something closer to the highway in the same town. I think there's either some property given or donated or bought or whatever, where they were going to build a new church building. Like, all of this stuff is fine. But then all of a sudden the pastor gets up and says, hey, the cloud is moving and we're going to Kansas City.
Okay. A word from a word of knowledge.
Yeah. And so, long story short, that's what happened. Like, 70 families packed up all their belongings, moved 2.5 hours down the road to Kansas City, uprooting everything. Then they bought this property, built up this new church, renamed World Revival Church of Kansas City. Gosh, I think there's something like 72 acres that they own. So they built up a couple, huge compound. Church still not that big. I know the Fox 4, they reported 400 people. I think it's a little bit more than that. I think there's probably a core of maybe like 5 to 6, but like maybe it's shrunk. So I don't know where that number came from.
I heard somewhere it was between 700 and 1,000. So that's
that's what they say. That is so far.
You think
off.
That's more? Yeah, it's nowhere near 1,000.
So yeah, and
that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's been services where there has been 1,000 people who have showed up, but like, that's far from common.
It's not the normal weekly attendance.
Yeah, you might, on a Sunday morning, you might get 600 to 700, depending, but that's also like not a regular occurrence. Like, I've seen the attendance charge. So, where they're tracking all that numbers. Stuff.
So looking at this objectively now, you're saying, okay, they had this supposed outpouring when they were still in Smithton, and then suddenly Pastor Gray stands up one Sunday and just announces out of the blue, we're moving to Kansas City. But the whole thing, you could say, was a cynical marketing ploy just to gain numbers and attention and notoriety and all that. Would you say that now, looking at it?
Oh, 100%. Like, especially now, like, I've looked at stories that he's told where he said back in the day he was up for a recording contract, because he used to be a traveling musician before he became a pastor. And he was up for a recording contract between him and the Christian singer Carmen, but Carmen won out. I don't know if that's true or not, but like, you can, through something like that, you realize like there's been this drive for like fame.
Right. Notoriety, fame.
Yeah. And money.
Want to get it one way or the other.
Yeah. And so like, he decided that being a church pastor is like maybe his best bet. So,
right.
And it's never quite worked out.
Yeah. It's not unusual.
Yeah. It's not uncommon.
Because I've got a good friend of mine. We used to be building contractors in the States before I moved over here. And he ended up going down to Mexico as a missionary and then finally landed in Texas at a big church there. And the guy who was the pastor, same kind of thing. He told me one time that he was a failed rock star. You know, he tried to make it big, didn't make it. And he saw the church as his sort of new stage, as it were. Mm-hmm. You know, so he would do these performances every Sunday. And he was really good as a musician. But clearly that was his, new venue. If I can't be a rock star, I can at least be the pastor of a church. I've got a captive audience here.
Yeah. And so that's, I'm not faulting you for wanting to be famous, but like it's one of those things, like, I know people have that, like, I was like out for a while. I'm like, someone would mention something like, well, that's not really like a cult thing. Like, that's kind of a normal church evangelical thing. Mm-hmm. And then like all these little pieces stuff coming together. And I noticed a lot, because my personal experience was a lot different than a lot of the people I grew up. Because around the time they moved to Kansas City, they also started like a private school church school. Like, again, not that uncommon. I didn't go because they weren't accredited. My mom's an educator, and so I went to a public school.
You're very fortunate.
Yeah, and I was lucky in the fact that I went to public school, and like my parents actually let me be involved with stuff. So like, I got to do like, hey, cross country, theater, band, show choir, track, all that stuff. Like, none of my friends got that experience. So when the revival started, obviously services were added. So on top of the Sundays, eventually once the Sunday night service was cut, but then we had like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, all in church. And so especially like if you're a student at the school, you're in school at the church.
Right. You're living there 24/7.
Yeah. They're living there 24/7. I think one of the first red flags I noticed is when I left for college, going to ORU, and then they had a school of ministry, and I thought, that's cool. That's not the way I want to go, but, ministry school, revival. Yeah, this makes sense. Like, raise up some people, send them out, like, let revival spread. That's my mindset I'm thinking. But then I started noticing that these people who went to the ministry school didn't leave.
Right. They got sucked in.
I'm like, why are you still here? You got your education, you got your training. Like, why aren't you going out?
Spread the gospel.
Yeah. So then I realized years later, my wife told me she ended up being a ministry school student. And she said, yeah, like they tell you, like, this is the ark. Why would you leave the ark? And I'm like, wait, what's going on here?
Wait a minute. More red flags.
Yeah. And I start seeing people who like left the church just like really struggling with stuff, but they're not talking about it. So I don't know what's going on, because like I got to be a little bit more detached. Like even I had jobs where I could work like during those like revival church service, because I didn't feel that pressure, because I wasn't there 24/7.
You were again fortunate in that regard.
Yeah, I was.
Because these are now raising cult, like you said, cult awareness markers. As we know, one of the classic markers of cults is keep the members so busy. They're physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted, and they're always something going on. And you're too busy all the time to think critically and question what's happening. That is a classic cult technique, isn't it?
Absolutely. Like, I mean, it's one of like every list that you go through of like, it's like, what makes a cult? Like that's the signs. Like
almost,
they're always there. And then like you throw in like the pastoral staff like encourages lack of sleep. It's like, I don't know, stay up praying.
You're literally exhausted.
Yeah. So like they're not even like having the time for like outside reading of like, the Bible to see if like, hey, does this check out? Like, I mean, I know some of your listeners like have different thoughts, beliefs, and things on the Bible. Like, I understand that. I mean, I've in my deconstruction of what is Christianity too, so I totally get that. But
a lot of questions.
Looking at from that objective aspect of like, hey, like, is what the pastor's saying, does it even line up with Scripture? Like, there's not time to do that. If you're not even supposed to read books that haven't been read and okayed by the pastor. My wife got in trouble for that. She was at some like newly married wives thing, and one of the people were struggling, and my wife said, hey, have you read this book? This really helped me out. And then she got pulled aside and chewed out for recommending a book that was not read by the pastor's wife. Like, okay.
Right. So now we're getting into like Stephen Hassan's bite model. That's one of them, information control, isn't it? The cult members, their reading material, what they're exposed to is severely limited by the cult leadership, because they don't want them exposed to different opposing ideas that might, get them to question the doctrine or dogma.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I even like remember personally like being invited to go to like a men's book study type of thing. It's like, oh, so what's the book that we're going to be going over? Like thinking like, is it like C.S. Lewis or I don't know, like John Bevere, whoever
so
is
classic,
like classic.
Right, not controversial.
Like, no. It turned out the book was going to be Steve Gray's book, My Absurd Religion. I'm like, I've been listening to this guy talk for like 20 plus years. Like, I don't want to go to a book study where I'm just going over the same thing that I hear. Like,
what's he going to tell you in the book that you haven't already heard?
Right. Like, no, I'm not going to do that. And this was before like I even like realized the damage that this place was holding.
So I just wanted to say, before we get too far into it, your parents obviously must have made that move from Smithton to Kansas City.
Yeah.
They were part of that core group that upped stakes and moved to KC. Did you hear any pushback from them at the time? Like, wow, this is a big step.
No.
Why are we doing this? It was like, okay, we're going. This is what God wants us to do.
Yeah. And spoiler, my parents are still there. My sister is still there. My brother is not, but yeah, they're parents
plugged in.
Yeah, they're plugged in. They're like, at this point, there might be one other family who's been a part of the Grays ministry longer than them.
Right. I was going to say, now, going back to that move, many of these things are common or uncommon in Christianity. Again, though, that's not all that unusual for a church or pastor to completely move. And I think some of it's a loyalty test, isn't it? We're going to see who's dedicated. Because we had a gal, when I was the pastor of the church in Portland, we had a woman who lived in Portland, but the more I got to know her, she told me this horrific story. She'd been part of a very, very small church, I should say a church, but it was really a cult in Southern California. She grew up there. And one day, same kind of thing, the pastor just stood up in the middle of the service and said, "We're all moving to Portland, period. Next week." And
that's
so
a bigger move than
so it was,
Kansas City,
or another state away. And again, a bunch of families made the move, and they, within a very short time, sold houses and everything else, quit jobs. And it was like, if you're serious, you're going to come to Portland because that's where God wants us to be.
Mm-hmm.
So that, again, is not unusual for a high control group to do something like that, to sort of weed out the wheat from the chaff sort of thing and see who's really going to be standing at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure it was probably easier to do with that move. But with ours, like, anyone who didn't move was cut off from communication.
Right. So they were shunned. Again, classic cults.
Yeah.
Dispensing of existence. You shun the people who don't come along. Yep. So we're hitting a lot of the markers of a cult anyway. We haven't even gotten into the doctrine, and I know there's a lot of abuses that are now coming out.
Yeah, like we haven't even touched on
we haven't gotten to that yet. This is still the backstory.
Yeah, we're still in the backstory.
Right. When are we going to get to the actual current events?
Yeah. So, it took me a while to realize, like, what this was. And, like, seeing, like, the trauma from people who left and the things that they were struggling with, like, really started asking myself, what the hell has been going on with this church that I thought was a church that was doing good things, been going on with? Because, like, I was so fired up that in college, like, I was a theater major, but people kind of, like, half expected me to go into ministry because of, like, how, I guess, like, on fire Christian I was. And I think the detachment from World Revival Church helped with that, and the fact that I could leave to go somewhere else. I thought, I was like, hey, like, I'm gonna bring, like, that extra, like, shot of Jesus into wherever I go, like, help people love him more. All that jazz. Then seeing the issues that people, like, that's when I, like, really started having questions, like, what's going on, especially, like, when it was, like, friends that I was close with and grew up with, and, like, friends of mine who, like, they're doing, like, hardcore drugs, like, recreationally. I'm like, this isn't, I mean, like, I've been around, like, other Christians, like, this, like, I mean, sure, some deal with that, but, like, not to the degree where it's, like, 90%, like, are, like,
that's serious,
going through this, or, like, suicides, or other kinds of things like that. It's not the, like, hey, like, like, I'm going to go through my rebellious phase and go party or whatever. Like, like, we're talking about serious stuff.
Yeah.
Like, I had a hard time for a while getting people to open up. And now, I guess, like, a few years ago, like, I really started thinking, like, hey, like, I come from a military background, and I was a photojournalist for the Air Force for a while. And so I'm like, like, I know journalism, like, I know this stuff, like, let's work on something, like, for my own, what the heck did I go through type of project.
Right. So you can objectively analyze it, sort of critically, like, from a more objective point of view.
Yeah. It's like, what are the real stories? Like, can I back up the information?
Yeah. Do you have the receipts for it?
Right. And especially, like, if I know the people, then I know they're going to tell the truth. Like, I know who I can trust and who I can't trust. So yeah, that's when I, like, really started digging in and finding out all this information. Like, wait, what?
What the hell?
Yeah. Like, and this is where I'm like, okay, obviously, like, there's regular, like, spiritual, religious trauma coming from the teachings. Like, for example, like, the pastor will go through in a service, and, like, I actually downloaded a video of this, like, as proof, like, no, he absolutely says this stuff.
He said it. Yeah. You've got him on, like, record.
he went through the congregation and he's like, you know what? I always know like what kids are going to leave their parents. Like the parents like badmouth Steve. Usually like the kids leaving and that spirit of rebellion or division or whatever is going to follow, and those parents are going to lose their relationships with their kids. Basically putting that pressure on parents like, oh, I can't badmouth or critique or criticize any of this stuff at all. Otherwise, I'm going to really lose my relationship with my kids. Or there's another service that like I was able to grab before they pulled the video footage of, where this young lady and her husband went up and said like, yeah, Steve wanted us to tell the story about this lunch that we had on him. Like we just begged him, don't ever stop what you're doing. Don't ever stop what you're doing. And like she literally in the middle of the service, she got down on her knees begging Steve Gray to not stop what he's doing.
That's what? Yeah. What is going on here? That ain't normal for a typical mainstream. If it's just a mainstream sort of charismatic evangelical church, you don't see that kind of stuff typically. Yeah, so there's some serious red flags. We're going to be right back with the second half of this conversation with Daniel Phelps, talking about surviving the World Revival Church cult out of Kansas City. Some really strange stuff going on in there for sure. And we're going to talk about some of the theology as well as how it relates to some of the models of cults that we know of from sociologists and cult experts. So stay tuned for that. Just wanted to mention what's coming up real quick here on Mindshift Podcast. I've got an episode coming out with Ryan Stoller coming up soon. In fact, that's the next episode that's going to drop. We had a really interesting conversation the other day about his experiences growing up as a Christian homeschooler, and now he's an advocate speaking out against the abuses within the system. He's done a ton of research, writing. Of course, that's his own lived experience. So that was a fascinating conversation with Ryan coming up. Also, keep an eye out for the episode that I did with Rachel Bernstein of the Indoctrination Podcast. I'm not sure when that's going to drop, but we're coordinating that so we can release the first half on her platform and then the second half that we did here on Mindshift Podcast. And then, speaking of other podcasts, I don't know how many of you have been listening to the Christianity Today series on the collapse of Mars Hill Church in Seattle, Mark Driscoll. This is a subject that I've always been really fascinated in. I visited the church myself a couple times, and that has led me to start investigating a little bit further. Obviously, it's coming from an evangelical perspective, so there's some limitations, I think, to the Christianity Today one. But as I was doing my research, I realized that one of the former guests we've had on this show before, Dr. Warren Throckmorton, he was one of the early bloggers that jumped on the Mars Hill stuff when some of the scandals were starting to come out years ago. So I've been in touch with him, and then once we nail down a day and a time, we're going to do an episode kind of talking about his story, looking at how he investigated the Mars Hill stuff, and even now, more stuff's coming out. So he's written some blog posts on his own blog, and there's also another one called The Roys Report, Julie Roys, and she's been doing some investigative research on what's happening now in this church that he planted over in Scottsdale, Arizona, which has basically become a cult that Mars Hill never was. The cult that Mars Hill, he wished it would have been, I guess. So he's now got free reign to run his place into the ground. And I've been doing a lot of research, as I say, so I might do a standalone episode, just kind of doing my thoughts and my research. So look out for that as well. Certainly coming up with Dr. Warren Throckmorton at some point here. And also then at the end of August, we're going to be doing a live Zoom call with Frank Schaeffer. Sitting here on my desk, I've got his new book that he just sent to me. It's called Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, and it's the uncorrected reader's copy. And so this is really cool. We're going to be doing a live Zoom call, like I say, with Frank, with a group of probably 6 or 8 of us, people that support the show on Patreon, people who are part of the Closed Mindshift Podcast Facebook group. We're putting this call together, and we're going to do a conversation. This is going to be absolutely amazing. Everyone has gotten an advanced copy of the book. I've gotten a PDF copy, and I've been authorized to send them out to the people who want to be a part of this call. And it's actually not too late. You could still be a part of this call. Support the show on Patreon. You'll find out more information about how you can be a part of that group call with Frank Schaeffer coming up, talking about his new book, around about the end of August this month. So this is really cool, exciting news. We're kind of taking the summer off for some of our Patreon stuff. We've got David Johnson booked in for September. We're going to be talking to him. Of course, he was on the podcast a few episodes ago talking about the history of racism and the church in America. And so he's going to be the first guest for our Mindshift Zoom call starting up again in September. And of course, we're going to start up our patron-only calls as well in the month of September, which we do once a month as well. So if you want to be a part of that community, as I said, look at the show notes. You'll find the link to my Patreon page, and you can find the instructions on how to join and support the show. If you support the show at a $5 a month level, I'll give you a really cool little gift. Only you can get it here in North Wales. If you support the show at a $10 a month level, I'll send you a free Mindshift Podcast t-shirt. So some cool benefits, as well as getting the episodes every week early before it goes out to the general public. So that's another cool little benefit, as well as being part of our closed Mindshift Podcast Facebook group. All right, let's get back into the second half of the conversation with Daniel Phelps as he continues to describe how he survived the World Revival Church cult out of Kansas City. What about its sort of theological slant? Where does it come from? Because is it affiliated with like IHOP KC, the International House of Prayer, Mike Bickle's church?
No.
Are they a New Apostolic Reformation type thing?
No, they're honestly more along the lines of Word of Faith and Prosperity Gospel.
Mm-hmm.
There is some, Save Israel theology, which is, super common in the mainstream, but like that's where you're gonna see it, like, speaking in tongues, Trinity, like if you give money, like God's gonna bless you tenfold.
Sure. So they're like in the Kenneth Copeland, Kenneth Hagin type camp. Are they affiliated with any of those guys? I mean, would Steve Gray cite anyone as like a mentor figure, saying, hey, I read so-and-so's books, he or she has influenced me in this way theologically?
He tried to get some close ties with Rodney Howard-Browne. I think they had a bit of a relationship for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how deep. I actually could figure out because I got a friend of mine from college who's actually like Rodney Howard-Browne's kids.
Okay.
I haven't dug into that, and I know they had tried to form a relationship with Kenneth Copeland I honestly don't know about Mike Bickle and IHOP. I feel like there's, especially since they're both in Kansas City, I feel like there's some tension there is the idea that I've gotten.
Oh, right. Like competing for turf.
Yeah. And
although IHOP KC is huge compared to, if World Revival's church around 400 or 500 people, IHOP KC's got thousands of people, isn't it? It's a true mega church, isn't it?
It's not really a church. It's just a ministry. I think there is a church affiliated with it, but it's just a ministry. Training ground, all that stuff, but they don't actually have like church services.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. I studied it a little bit when I was doing like the Bethel Redding guys. There's some affiliation with Bill and Benny Johnson and that kind of crowd, the New Apostolic Reformation crowd. Yeah. Dominionist. There's some strange things going on at IHOP KC, that's for sure, as well as Bethel Redding,
100%,
which is another whole story. But so they're not affiliated though with that type of movement.
No. And honestly, I think one of the biggest things, World Revival Church, you can't prophesy without Steve Gray's permission at World Revival Church.
A lot of control.
Yeah.
He's firmly in control of it.
It was actually just this past week, I was remembering moments where my family, we were like out visiting family somewhere else. We went to this church and my parents got permission to like speak by the pastor of that church. Like, hey, you see, like, here's a fired up family, like, tell us about yourselves, whatever. And then like later on, my parents would go back and say, hey, Steve, we had this cool moment. And he shooed them out. Now I realize, he said it was a safety thing, but now I realize, no, you're speaking in ministry without my permission, giving credit back to the church. Like I actually saw an email recently where someone said like, yeah, these people left, they had their blessing, but it's really weird that when you go to their ministry website, they don't like talk about Steve Gray or World Revival Church at all. So that really concerns us that they do that. I'm like, no, like this is their own personal thing that they're doing. It has nothing to do. Why would they talk about another church?
Yeah, something's not right there. Well, so it's getting some traction, isn't it? Because as you say, there's that Fox News article that it's abuses are coming to light. Then I found another website called checkmychurch.org. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yes.
Sarah Leanne Young. Yeah.
I actually helped her with a lot of her research for that.
Because I could see, she links to because you run that Facebook page, isn't that right? Or are you part of that?
So, okay. That's the whole thing altogether.
Yeah, because there's a Facebook page. What's it called? And what's it all about?
So the Facebook page is called Casey Cult Survivor. And it is run by I'm going to do this because it's not going to show up on the page. A team of people.
In air quotes, yeah.
Yeah, a team of people who are dedicated to objectively exposing what's going on in the church. So former members will send in their stories anonymously if they don't want to have their face out there. If you go through comments, you'll see people share with their names attached to it, but most of the stories that come across are done anonymously, verified, fact checked, making sure everything is legit. These are real stories. Or they'll email things in, documents, emails that
church correspondence, things like that.
That the church definitely doesn't want to be seen, and I know that they're kind of freaking out that there's a leak going on.
Right, the spotlight is being shown on. Well, what's the common thread? I had a look at the page real quickly the other day when you and I were messaging about doing this podcast. Are there some common threads that you see person to person to person who have been abused by the church? What are the common threads?
Common things: victim shaming. One of the big ones that's come across is workplace abuse of employees while paying them ridiculously low wages. Was one. It's hey, it's we're going to bump up your pay raise to $20,000 a year while you're working 80 to 100 hours a week. And, if you want to make a little bit more money, maybe you should start coming to more services.
As if you're not going to enough. Yeah. Right. So they're exploiting economically the workers. That's one thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And on top of that, if you're a school ministry student to cheapen your tuition, then you also need to volunteer at the church while going to all the church services while being in their school. Now you need to put some work hours in too. So they're constantly 24/7. They're not getting any sleep, which, if you look into this stuff, lack of sleep is a common classic way to brainwash people into things where thinking hey, you're not safe. If you leave this church, you're going to get cancer and die. What was another fun? One of the school of ministry instructors, who I don't know what his qualifications are to be teaching anyone. He definitely doesn't have any college degree at all. Was
no formal education.
Yeah. It's he told the students, even if an angel of the Lord comes to you and gives you a message, I would tell that angel, go tell Pastor Steve first to tell me.
Right. So we're seeing that. Yeah. He's a very controlling person. Because I watched, there was a video. I was unable to open the Fox article because here in the UK, we have European restrictions sometimes on websites. But I think Yahoo News picked it up. At least there was a video attached to that Fox report, because she went around and talked to a couple of families, and they said one of the common things I picked up on was that the church had destroyed their family. And that must be another common thread where people are staying in the church, people have left the church, they've been shunned and, blacklisted and all the rest of it. And it's just split families right down the middle.
Oh, yeah. And one of it, especially for kids who are just exposed to all kinds of abuse. Man, where to start on that?
Right.
Okay, so let's do family punishment of kids first. There's a ministry training manual that, obviously talks about spanking, but then it gets so extreme, for escalating punishment. It's want to know a good way to break that child's rebellious attitude? Withhold food from them. So they're literally talking about forced fasting for kids.
Starving your child. Starve your child into submission.
Literally written in their training manual. It talks about forced fasting for kids. I'm a parent.
That's straight abuse.
There's no way I would withhold food from my kid if they're hungry.
Absolutely, yeah. No matter how much trouble they're in, they still need to eat. You're their parent. You have to take care of them.
Yeah, it's the most I might do is like, hey, we're eating dinner in 5 minutes. No, you can't have like all of that.
You can smell it cooking.
Yeah.
You'll be in your room on a timeout or getting spanked. That's crazy. Yeah, that's going beyond, because I mean I was raised in the Bill Gothard cult, and they taught corporal punishment as a means to break the child's will, which I was spanked thousands and thousands of times as a kid, but we never never went without a meal.
Right. Like I haven't heard of any place that advocates for forced fasting of kids.
Yeah, that's crazy. And so parents are literally abusing their kids by withholding food from them, in addition to the corporal punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all some of the teachings of Steve Gray.
Yeah, that is. And then you can get into the darker stuff where there's been like actual like sexual abuse and assault that's been covered up
by the pastor.
Yeah, by the pastor. Officially, he says like it's never been reported or brought to his attention. That's
not true. Huh?
That's bullshit. It's such bullshit. So the first time I came across that was from a prior academy student. She had just turned 21, and this like really, her coming forward really opened the floodgates for people being willing to share their stories. So I have to get credit to her, and like documented that this did happen. Like she had the text messages with the people involved. Yeah, all of that. So she had turned 21, and she's like, hey, I want to try drinking with my friends for the first time. And so there were two guys there, one who was involved on the worship team, and the other was the pastor's granddaughter. When the Kansas City Star talked about this one, the church said, no, this isn't the pastor's granddaughter. Like, this person has no involvement with church relationship at all. And then I went to like her wedding photos, and I said, oh, look, here's the pastor walking her down the aisle. Here's the wedding photographer saying like, my grandparents. So right, her. You can say that, but like, no, she's absolutely the pastor's granddaughter.
Yeah, it's definitely
not
her.
Biologically.
So they're straight up lying. Yeah, distancing themselves.
Yeah. So basically what happened, the pastor's granddaughter and like these other guys got this girl to drink something like insane amount, like 20 shots or something like that. So she was blackout drunk. And one of the guys took advantage of her in that state, even though she had said multiple times, no, I don't want to sleep with this person. Because she was
not consensual.
She's like, no, I don't want to do this. And I guess like in the middle, she was even saying no too. The girl said like, I actually remember the pastor's granddaughter coming in, seeing this guy and what he was doing, laughing and walking out the door. Then afterwards got her to like take a shower, do anything to like remove evidence of what happened. They preemptively went to the police, told the police this didn't happen. I know one of my family member of mine told my parents who went to go to talk to the pastors, and the pastors were told, we are aware of what happened and we are handling this. And so like there's a whole issue like with police and investigating sexual assault. So that's a whole other story. But the point is like church knew, pastor's granddaughter involved, and there's screenshot text messages as well as apology letter from the guy who did it, all confirming that this 100% in fact did
definitely happen.
Yeah.
And they basically covered it up.
Yeah, they covered it up. That's just one. Another one I know of where a friend of mine was assaulted by a member on staff. His brother was assaulted by a member on staff. And when they went to go talk to the pastor's daughter, who's like kind of the admin person in charge of everything, brought in the abuser to all of them have a sit-down discussion about this. That's like a no. You don't.
That's so inappropriate.
You don't bring the abuser in with the victim.
No way. Yeah, that's hugely inappropriate.
Yeah, like, and these are just a few. Like, there's a couple other stories with it too. Like, I know, like, yeah, like legit child predators. Like, there is a man who is closely involved with the church too, who somehow got trusted parents and would have like young kids over at his house, and he'd be feeding them like alcohol.
What the hell's going on?
Yeah, and that's when I realized, oh, that's why all my friends are like having so many issues, because this was happening to them.
Yeah, they were abused as children.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, though, these are classic kind of cult markers, aren't they?
Yeah.
You know, from a PR point of view, you can't have anything bad about the cult. So these stories are suppressed and covered up and silenced by the leadership because they don't want it reflecting badly on them. And yet that just means it's an environment rife for more abuses, isn't it? Because the abusers know they can get away with it with impunity. They'll just keep abusing.
Yeah. And like more and more stories come out like this. Like, and a point is made to always say like every story counts. And I think some people have a hard time, like, we're like, well, I wasn't like physically abused. I wasn't sexually abused. So like my abuse and trauma that I went through isn't valid. Like, no, like you're in a cult, like you were indoctrinated to like,
you still have religious trauma syndrome.
Steve and revival before everything else. Like, so your family was important. If people left, like you had to cut off friendships, like just like point blank. If someone was considered fringe, like they were in danger of leaving, they were told, hey, don't talk to these people. Like, don't be friends with these people. So I know people who had struggled, like being involved and feeling like they were part of a community because later on they realized people were warned not to talk to them.
And those, again, classic cult markers. Well, we were talking about when we were messaging a couple of weeks ago, setting this podcast up, I mentioned that what I'd done, I put that Fox article in our closed Facebook group, and we had a lot of comments on it, about it's called Congregation or Cult, Former Members Accuse Kansas City Church of Abuse, Fox 4 Kansas City. And one of our patrons, his name's Daniel. He's actually a British guy. Do you want to hear his story? Because I want to hear what your reaction is to. So they visited World Revival Church. So Daniel posted up and he said, yes, I know this church. He said, I went there in 2000. It was in a big semi-permanent tent that they were having meetings. This is all ringing a bell.
I remember that time.
Yeah. He says
we were in a tent on that property for a whole year.
Right. So
the coldest winter, the hottest summer. Oh,
well, you're right in there with Greg Locke. His church in Tennessee is meeting in a circus tent. But Daniel goes on to say, it was the weirdest thing I've ever been to. We got there early and they made us stand in the sweltering sun outside for ages. And then they wouldn't let me pray for my friend because I wasn't in the ministry team.
Yep.
Does that sound familiar?
That is like one thing they say, like if someone doesn't have a prayer badge, don't let them pray for you or don't let them pray for anyone else.
But why? Why can't, he was a Christian at the time. Why couldn't he pray for his friend?
I wish I had a good answer for that.
More control.
That's really what it comes down to. Like it was said in the name of safety because some people aren't safe to pray for people. And so they want to make sure the sanctuary is a safe place. That's what they say. Obviously it's crazy talk, but that's the
official line.
That's the official line.
Right. Okay. Well, there's more to the story. So he goes on to say, in another thread, he says, I remember that day clearly and often think back on it. We were going for the weekend at the start of our year out thing because they had come down from Canada. He says, we drove down from Winnipeg as there was quite a bit of buzz about it then, which I think you're talking about. That was when the talk of the revival and stuff was going on. He says, we only went to one meeting as our leaders felt something was off, so we went to the next dodgy place, IHOP and Mike Bickle's church. He said
the next dodgy place. I love
that. He said, I met Mike Bickle in the toilets, which was weird. Then he goes on to say, at the World Revival Church in KC, one of our group went forward for the gift of speaking in tongues. Spent the entire rest of the trip speaking in tongues wherever we went, like in Denny's, and even walked into a lamppost because of it. When we got back to the church in Winnipeg, the pastor cast a demonic spirit out of him because his tongues weren't discerned to have been godly. Lots of African-sounding noise with ba, 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 ba sounds. Then he started speaking in more, quote, normal tongues after that. What a week of my life that was. So that's the story of Daniel, his visit in 2000 to World Revival Church in Kansas City.
I mean, I don't even know where to go with.
Where do you begin?
Speaking of tongues, like that's a whole discussion.
A
whole nother topic that could be had right there. Like, what is that really?
What's going on with that?
Yeah.
I know you've got to go for another family thing in a few minutes, but while we're wrapping up, what's the point of you doing all this activism? Why are you speaking out? Why are you trying to raise the profile of this issue about this church, which you believe is a destructive cult?
So I get that question a lot. Like, why are you doing this? I'm like,
mm-hmm.
like, do you really think people are going to leave? So many lives have been damaged by this place. The name of the Facebook page, it's called KC Cult Survivor. It's open so anyone can go to it. That's done on purpose because we want people to be aware of what's going on. While I don't think that it would have that much of an impact on people leaving, because this is a cult, a lot of times like stuff like this makes them dig in harder. Mm-hmm. I think what it can do is it can keep people from coming and them getting hurt, their children getting hurt.
That might prevent someone from...
Yeah, and ultimately there's always been a high turnover rate in the church. People,
mm-hmm.
they
revolving
get
door.
burned out. Yeah, like I said, there's only like 2 or 3 families that have been there from the beginning. And this was a church that were originally 70, 80 families uprooted their lives. There's like 2 or 3 left. So people leave. And like some people like, I want this place to be shut down, whatever. Like, I think the biggest way to have that happen is to have new members stop coming.
Right.
And
so education is a primary goal.
Yeah. And if people stop coming, eventually there's not going to be anyone left because people leave.
Well, and the element of support has got to be huge for those members, for example, in that Facebook group that have shared their stories. One of the biggest things is simply just telling your story, because I'm sure reading some of the threads in that Facebook group, people are saying, oh my gosh, the same thing happened to me. I'm not the only one. That's hugely validating, isn't it?
I can't think of a single story where someone has said, I didn't experience the same thing.
Yeah, it wasn't an outlier.
Yeah, there's not been a single outlier.
Right. So that tells you a lot right there. There's a pattern of abuse, or abuse
mm-hmm.
is plural, really, isn't there, within this system?
Yeah. And also, shortly after the Fox 4 article, World Revival Church put out a fact sheet on their website, basically.
I saw that.
Discounting the claims, and also a couple claims that I wasn't aware of. So now I'm questioning, like, okay,
wait a minute. I didn't know about that one.
Yeah, I was like, I didn't know about that. So now I'm totally questioning that one.
Better chase that one up too.
Yeah. I showed it a few people who were specifically attacked and kind of called out vaguely in the fact sheet. I sent screenshots of them and like, hey, just, this is what they're saying. And they're like, oh my gosh, that lying.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yep. So they're trying to get out ahead of some of these stories. It sounds like before they even maybe become public, we're getting out ahead of the headlines in a way. That's another classic thing. You got to watch out for that. I mean, if your church has been called a cult, that might be a sign that it might be a cult, and that's another red flag, isn't it?
Yeah, they also hired an investigator into themselves who they say came back saying, hey, we didn't do anything wrong.
Right. Nothing to see here, folks.
Which, by the way, that investigator was a employment lawyer in Georgia, so a completely other state, and people were advised don't talk to the lawyer. So, of course, the lawyer couldn't find anything. So, Of course, there's nothing to report. So the church said, hey.
Yeah, we got a clean bill of health. We're fine.
Yeah, it's like it's really easy what you cannot find when you investigate yourself.
Exactly. And did he talk to any ex-members like yourself or others who've suffered a lot of abuses? If he was only talking to people at the church at the time, they're literally singing from the same hymn sheet. If they did talk to him at all, they're going to tell him the same story that's probably been approved by Pastor Steve Gray.
Oh, well, that reminds me of another weird story I hadn't brought up. And I guess this will have to be like my wrapping up.
Okay.
So a lot of this really got started was because was it last summer? I got a call from my dad saying that he got a call from Steve Gray that there were some people mad at me because I was trashing the church online. I hadn't said anything.
Mm-hmm.
I had been talking to some friends, just trying to figure out what's been going on at the church, because I didn't know, because I was kind of an outsider to a lot. And apparently these guys were going to find me, hunt me down. If they couldn't hurt me, they were going to hurt my family. I'm like, really? Nobody knows where I live. I'm halfway across the country, from Missouri.
That's so weird.
So I'm like, okay. So I'm like, but if they're going to say stuff like this, like, I'm going to publicize that this happened. So then I made a post on Facebook. I'm like, yeah. So there's these like revival vigilantes that are after me and are threatening my family. So just so you know, this happened, which that like kind of spread around pretty quick. And then
but it kicked
my
off
dad
then.
got a call from Steve Gray saying, no, I didn't say those things. And my dad's like, I don't really want to be involved with this. Like, maybe you should just talk directly. I was like, can Steve give you a phone call? I'm like, yeah, sure.
Okay.
I'm like, okay, I don't know what he's going to say, but I know one thing for sure. I'm going to record this.
Yes. I was going to say, I hope you recorded it.
I'm 100% going to record this. Like, my first thought was, okay, like, I'm not going to tell him. I just want to hear what he says. And then somebody like, you may want to look up the legality of that. And because some states are like two-party, both parties need to be aware. And because of where I live, I'm in a two-party state. Missouri is a one-party. Mm-hmm. But it's like, let's just be on the safe side. So Steve called me and I said, hey, just so you know, like, just letting you know I'm recording this conversation. And so we just had a conversation and just trying to get to the bottom of like this whole revival vigilante thing. And that is on YouTube. It's called Conversation with Steve Gray. So if you want to hear how that went, knock yourself out. I think it's got more than 1,000 views at this point. Mm-hmm. It's worth hearing the character and the way they like talk around stuff.
It's quite revealing as to where he's coming from.
Yeah, it's funny.
I think you sent me that link as well, so we can put that in the show notes. I was thinking too, in the show notes, we'll also put the link to the Facebook group as well. So I'm thinking if people are former members of the church or perhaps in the Kansas City area thinking, hey, I might be church shopping. This World Revival Church sounds like it's a really cool going concern. Well, let's give them some information before they check out this place and maybe, like you said, head a few of them off, hopefully a lot of them off before they even set foot in the place.
Yeah, and honestly, too, just because like we've only like really scratched the surface of a lot. Education is a big thing. So like if you have questions, like message the page. Like some people are like, like I feel skeptical. I'm like, that is totally okay. Like
absolutely.
I had questions for a long time. Like I didn't realize what this was until I really started digging in. And now like I'm even like beginning to realize some of my own like trauma and stuff that I'm trying to sort through. There's like, oh my gosh, like how damaged was I without realizing it?
Oh yeah, man. We just had this discussion last night. I was on a podcast with a good friend of mine, David Hayward, the Naked Pastor, the Still Unbelievable podcast. Yeah, he's a good friend of mine. And we were recently on a panel for the conference on religious trauma as 3 ex-pastors, me, him, and Tim Sledge, the Goodbye Jesus ex-pastor out of Houston, Texas. And we realized that, my God, when we were pastors, we were traumatized badly. And I've just started thinking about, like you said, more stuff starts coming up when you really dive into what we went through in our time in evangelicalism or in this cultic sort of movement. So it's a big thing, isn't it? You're always peeling back the layers of the onion.
Yeah, it's true. Like just got to keep trying to figure out and, counseling.
That's why we keep doing work on religious trauma syndrome. I keep doing more and more episodes because I realize I myself have suffered so much of it, and people that I hear from like yourself, they're like, oh my God, I've got a lot of work to do. Well, now I was thinking too, if people want to find you personally, I think we connected on Twitter actually originally, and then you started messaging me through the Facebook page. How can people find you? What's the best place on social media?
Facebook's probably the best way. Daniel Phelps. It's a super common name. So
there's a million Daniel Phelpses out there.
there's a lot out there. But
sounds like the Facebook page is the best place to go if you're
Casey
looking
Cult
for
Survivor is
information.
going to be the easiest, most direct way.
Right. That's your first port of call. It sounds like.
Mm-hmm. And then like if you want to get a hold of me personally from that, I can.
There's ways to do it.
Point you in the right direction that way.
All right. Cool.
Cult Survivor.
Well, as you say, we probably just scratched the surface, but maybe we could do another episode. We could do a little bit more chatting and talk about some of the specific things. I'm interested to hear what people's comments and feedback are off the back of this conversation, especially if we find someone who is part of the church. That might lead to some really interesting stuff. So Thank you, Daniel, for your activism, for your work that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.